In the spring of 1978, Dean Holloway eased a 1971 Chevrolet C20 into the gravel lot at Miller's Coffee Stop outside Hutchinson with 287,000 miles on the odometer, rust blooming through both fenders, and baling twine holding the driver's side mirror in place like a stubborn promise. Men leaned against newer diesel pickups nearby, talking in monthly numbers instead of acres, comparing $412 payments and $536 payments like those figures were proof of seriousness. Dean stepped out in faded overalls with 2 knee patches, wiped his hands on a shop rag, and walked in without hurry. Ruth followed with a plain canvas tote that held a calculator, 2 sharpened pencils, and a spiral notebook whose cover had been bent soft at every corner. He looked like the poorest man in the room. That was the first misread. At the far end of the counter, Wade Mercer sat with polished boots, crossed at the ankle, dealership cap clean enough to pass for a new stock, and a jacket that still carried the crease lines from pressing. Wade sold combines, tractors, and urgency, and by 1978, he had become the county voice of modern expansion. He saw Dean order black coffee, glanced toward the truck window, and said loudly enough for 3 tables to hear, "Dean, one bad season and that rig and your whole operation both disappear." There was laughter, not cruel exactly, but easy and convenient. Dean did not argue. He never did in public. Ruth set her tote on the empty stool beside her, opened the notebook to a folded receipt, checked a number, and whispered 7 words. Fuel came in lower than March estimate. Dean nodded once. They drank coffee and left 5 minutes later while 2 men still debated whether a 7-year note at 9.9% was better than 5 years, at 8.7% with a balloon. What nobody in that room could see from rust and denim was the operating structure behind the Holloway's life. They owned 80 acres near Reno County, clear and free, rented 260 more spread across Cloud County, and land outside Concordia, and ran the household on $7,900 a year. Housing maintenance was capped at $1,100. Groceries averaged $2,940. Utilities and heating fuel landed at $1,280. Clothing was budgeted at $320, including work gloves. Church and local giving received $360. Truck, licensing, and insurance sat at $900. Everything else had to fit inside the remaining $1,000. Their one non-negotiable rule was printed on the inside front cover of every spiral. No operating debt carried past harvest. That rule did not come from pride. It came from memory, arithmetic, and one hard lesson absorbed early and never forgotten. Dean was 19 in 1961 when he watched his Uncle Vernon lose a mixed farm outside Arlington after a variable note reset from 6.5% to 10.8% in 18 months. The payment jumped, feed prices rose, and one missed rain finished what the bank had started. Dean stood by the sale ring and watched strangers bid on things he had repaired with his own hands. A planter, 2 gravity wagons, a milk cooler, gone by lunch. He did not talk on the ride home. 2 weeks later, he started writing down every cost tied to his own custom haywork, right down to twine and shear bolts, because he had seen what happened when numbers stayed in a man's head too long. He met Ruth at a church supper in 1963. She worked weekdays at a small insurance office in Hutchinson and balanced premium records by hand. She had a quiet speaking voice and a precise habit of tapping a pencil twice before she wrote a figure she intended to keep. They married in November 1964, rented 120 acres in the first spring after, and planted milo and wheat with borrowed equipment, plus one used disc bought for $240 cash. Their first full-year farm ledger in 1965 showed gross receipts of $14,860 and total costs of $10,944, leaving $3,916 before taxes and household draw. Most couples would have called that thin. Ruth called it proof of control. From there, the Holloways built method before scale. They did not chase acres first. They chased repeatable margins. 1966. Leased an additional 40 acres at $21 per acre, paid $840 cash up front, produced 32 bushels per acre wheat average, net farm surplus $5,402. 1968. Bought a used grain drill at county auction for $375, spent $94 on seals and bearings, avoided a $2,900 dealer package, surplus $7,118. 1970. Purchased their first 80 acres near Reno for $29,600. Paid $11,000 down from accumulated cash, carried a short note at 7.2%, and retired it in 6 years instead of 15. Interest saved $8,436 versus full-term schedule. 1972. Severe input inflation year. Cut non-essential machinery spending to zero. Rented a neighbor's combine for harvest share rather than finance one. Ended year with $18,240 liquid. 1974. Added 100 rented acres across county line at $34 per acre. Shifted fertilizer timing to contract covered bushels only. No carryover operating debt on December 31st, 1976. Rebuilt transmission and hydraulics on a 1969 John Deere 4020 for $1. $460 in parts, plus Dean's labor, compared with dealer recommendation of new financed replacement at $58,000. By early 1978, the pattern was fixed. Ruth tracked each input and each output in spiral notebooks that looked ordinary enough to be mistaken for school supplies. Seed invoices, vet bills, diesel tickets, repair receipts, grain settlement slips, tax withholdings, lease terms by field and by landlord. She reconciled every page against bank statements down to the penny. If a number missed by even 37 cents, she did not close the month until she found the cause. 15 straight years. No broken chain. Ruth flipped to a fresh page, wrote the date in neat block numbers, and underlined it once, the way she did before seasons that tested discipline harder than pride ever could. Their discipline looked plain from the road because it was plain by design. Dean wore repaired coats because coats did not raise yield. Ruth drove to town once each Thursday, with a list organized by aisle to cut fuel waste and impulse spending. They bought canning jars by the case in winter and preserved enough vegetables to reduce summer grocery bills by 18%. They never ate out except pie after church socials 3 times a year. They did not call that sacrifice. They called it margin protection. On the farm, the same logic ran every decision. They serviced bearings before failure, not after. They changed fluids by hours, not by guesswork. They kept a shelf of labeled parts bought during off-season discounts. When neighbors financed newer paint, Dean bought distressed implements at auction, then rebuilt them nights in the machine shed. A chisel plow purchased for $620, plus $210 in steel, replaced a $7,400 financed alternative. A used grain auger for $480, plus a $72 motor capacitor and belt set, replaced a $3,200 installment purchase. not glamorous, highly effective. Then July 1979 arrived with hail hard enough to shred confidence. One storm stripped 42% of their wheat. 2 weeks later, the bank renewed their operating line at 16.2% variable instead of the prior 9.1% fixed. And the loan officer gave them the same speech many families heard that summer. You need real scale, real equipment, real financing, or you will not survive the decade. Cash tightened. The pressure was not imaginary. Wade Mercer arrived 3 days later in a new pickup with dealer plates and a folder, thick enough to look like certainty. He spread papers across the Holloway kitchen table and presented what he called the rational path: finance combine, finance planner, finance tractor, total package price, $186,400, monthly payment, $2,740, annual payment $32,880 before fuel, labor, seed, and repairs. He spoke in polished sequences about efficiency gains, tax positioning, and the danger of being left behind by modern operators. Dean listened longer than usual. He even picked up the pen. Ruth stood, went to the cupboard, and returned with spiral notebook number 11. She opened to a tab marked Equipment Actuals and read out 10 years of paid-for repairs. Annual average $11,380, with a high year at $14,920, and a low year at $8,640. She laid that beside Wade's payment schedule. $32,880 annual fixed obligation, regardless of rainfall, price, or yield. Then she turned one page and showed stress year interest scenarios modeled at 18.4%, with commodity downside and reduced bushels. Under that stack, the finance package converted one bad season into 2 bad years and 1 bad year into a liquidity crisis. No speeches followed, no drama. Dean set the pen down. Wade watched him for a full second, then said, "You cannot run a business by fear." Dean answered with 6 words. "It is not fear. It is math." Wade gathered his papers and left unconvinced. The county kept talking about progress, and the Holloways kept writing numbers in a spiral notebook at the end of each day, building a system most people mistook for thrift when it was actually strategy. The wager had been set in plain view: endure ridicule now, or borrow for status, and pray weather and rates stayed gentle. The screen door settled back into its frame after Wade left, and the kitchen went quiet enough for the clock over the stove to sound louder than usual. Dean stayed seated at the table, palm flat where the contract had been, while Ruth turned notebook number 11 toward herself and wrote one new line in the margin. July 1979, decline finance package, fixed obligation avoided $32,880 annual. She underlined annual twice, then closed the cover as gently as if it were a church hymnal. At dawn the next morning, Dean drove the same rusted Chevrolet C20 to the co-op parts counter in South Hutchinson for a set of sickle sections, 2 belts, and hydraulic fluid. His overalls were still patched at both knees. One boot had stitching hand-repaired with waxed thread, and the truck mirror still leaned outward on twine. 3 men in clean pearl-snap shirts stood near the seed display discussing down payments on new 4-wheel drive units, and one of them glanced at Dean's order slip and asked, not quietly, "You still patching that old combine together field by field?" Another answered for him, "Men who refuse to modernize end up selling out." The criticism did not come from malice. It came from the prevailing consensus of that moment, which treated leverage as sophistication and restraint as fear. Wade walked in 10 minutes later carrying a leather folder and wearing the same pressed dealership cap, and he placed a printed flyer on the counter where Dean could see it. Late summer incentive, 8.9% introductory rate, deferred first payment 90 days, approved package value up to $210,000. He tapped the number with one finger and told the room, "This is what scale looks like now." Dean paid $186.42 for parts and fluids in cash, folded the carbon receipt once, and handed it to Ruth without comment when he got back to the truck. She slid it into an envelope marked 1979 Harvest Prep. Parts actual. Appearance said one story. Cash flow said another. Before we go any further, if you want to see how a couple in patched denim quietly built enough liquidity to buy land other people thought only institutions could touch, subscribe, and stay with this all the way to the reveal. Ruth's discipline did not begin at that kitchen table. It began years earlier in a two-room farmhouse north of Nickerson, where her mother tracked grocery spending on the backs of feed invoices, and her father repaired neighbors' balers for cash, because hourly wage work disappeared every winter. In 1957, when Ruth was 12, her father accepted a handshake note for a used truck at 11.4% because he needed transportation for repair calls. 2 transmission failures and 1 weak wheat season later, they sold 2 heifers and half their laying flock just to avoid delinquency. Nobody repossessed anything. Nobody made a scene. Yet Ruth watched what debt service did to decision quality, how it narrowed options month by month until every choice became defensive. At 16, she opened her first savings account with $43.20 from bookkeeping work at a feed store and wrote every deposit in pencil in a school composition book, then checked it against the bank passbook every Friday. That habit became structure, and structure became identity. When she moved to Hutchinson for office work, she learned the insurance side of risk with practical clarity. Premium records did not care about pride. Claims did not care about optimism. Small probabilities multiplied into large consequences when people failed to price them honestly. By 1963, she could reconcile 12 policy ledgers in one afternoon and spot a transposition error at a glance. Dean had the field instinct. Ruth had the accounting reflex. Their partnership was not sentimental branding. It was functional decomposition of a volatile business into controllable units: yield risk, price risk, input timing, maintenance burden, tax exposure, household draw. They tested that framework immediately after they married. In 1965, they tracked gross receipts at $14,860 and farm costs at $10,944. But Ruth's internal ledger split those costs into categories neighbors rarely isolated. Fuel $1,206, seed $1,480, fertilizer $1,914, repairs $1,132, rent $2,520, hired help $486, insurance and fees $402, miscellaneous $1,804. She added one line most men ignored: preventable costs. That first year it totaled $312 from rush parts bought at retail during breakdowns. She wrote beside it, "Build shelf inventory in winter." By 1967, they had done exactly that, spending $418 off-season for belts, bearings, shear bolts, filters, hoses, and common seals that would have cost $689 in season. Savings were $271, small on paper, meaningful in aggregate. In 1969, when a neighbor financed a new planter package with $6,200 down and payments of $174 monthly for 60 months, Dean bought a used unit at auction for $1,050 cash and restored meter drives for $126. Total outlay $1,176. The financed alternative required $10,440 in total payments before interest shocks, and with fees it moved above $11,000. Ruth marked the comparison in red pencil and titled the column, Opportunity Cost of Impressing People. The no-debt philosophy hardened in 1970 when they bought their first owned 80 acres. The bank offered 15-year amortization that would have lowered annual payment pressure. But Ruth ran both schedules on legal pad sheets and showed Dean the full-term interest burden against likely commodity cycles. 6-year retirement at 7.2% required tighter annual cash discipline, yet preserved flexibility. 15-year amortization looked comfortable in year 1 and expensive in year 10. They chose 6 years, paid ahead in strong seasons, and closed it without extension. Total interest paid, $6,214. Modeled 15-year interest, $14,650. Difference retained, $8,436. Dean did not frame it as victory. He called it breathing room. The same arithmetic sat underneath dozens of decisions outsiders misread as stubbornness. They did not buy social signaling assets because signaling produced no bushels. They accepted lower convenience in exchange for higher resilience. In 1973, they skipped a family vacation and used $920 to insulate the farmhouse attic and weather-stripped doors, cutting winter heating costs by roughly 22% over the next 3 years. In 1975, they sold 12 feeder calves into a favorable market and put $4,800 directly into reserve rather than upgrade the pickup cab. In 1977, when 2 neighbors urged Dean to carry operating notes through winter to preserve liquidity optics, Ruth wrote one sentence on the front page of notebook number 10. Debt delayed is still debt due. By the second week of August 1979, after the hail loss and bank reset, those notebooks moved from useful to indispensable. Ruth laid them out across the kitchen table in chronological order. Volumes 1 through 11, each with field maps clipped inside the back cover and yearly summaries, paper-clipped to the front. She built a 10-year rolling margin model with 3 scenarios for 1980 through 1982. Normal rain, moderate shortfall, severe shortfall. She inserted variable rate cases at 14%, 16%, and 18.4%, then matched each against expected bushel ranges by field quality. Under financed equipment, severe shortfall exhausted liquidity in 19 months and forced asset sale in 27. Under paid-for equipment plus disciplined repairs, severe shortfall reduced reserves yet preserved operating control through 36 months with no forced sale. The model was not glamorous. It was decisive. Dean's early discipline routine tightened after that week. Mondays were parts inspection and service planning before sunup. Tuesdays and Wednesdays were fieldwork blocks with 1 fuel check at midday and 1 moisture check near dusk. Thursdays, Ruth drove to town with a fixed purchase list sorted by store layout to keep total trip cost under $18, including fuel. Fridays after supper, they reconciled every receipt to the daily log, then compared actuals against projected monthly spend. Variance above 5% required a written reason in the notebook. Variance above 10% required a change in next week's operations. They were not trying to look austere. They were building a repeatable control system in a business where weather could erase good intentions in 40 minutes. That fall, they put the system into public view at a small county auction where a neglected grain auger and an older field cultivator sat ignored near the back fence. Dean paid $460 for the auger and $780 for the cultivator, then spent $96 on wiring, $84 on bearings, and $132 on shovels and hardware. Total rehabilitation cost was $1,552. Equivalent finance replacements quoted through local dealers came in at $7,400 for the cultivator and $3,200 for the auger, a combined $10,600 before finance charges. At 10.5% over 5 years, the payment structure would have required roughly $226 per month and about $13,560 total outflow. Dean and Ruth's cash approach kept $12,008 inside their operation. Those are not symbolic numbers. Those are acres retained and options preserved. They applied the same precision to household living because personal overhead can quietly sabotage farm solvency. Ruth set a weekly food envelope at $56.50 and tracked per meal cost by season. Garden produce and canning lowered annual grocery draw from $2,940 to $2,412 over 2 years without touching nutrition. Clothing stayed at $320 by mending, trading children's items with relatives, and buying workwear in postseason clearance lots. Entertainment remained modest. County fair one day, church socials, library books, no resentment, no performance. Their lifestyle was aligned with strategy, not image. Wade kept stopping by, sometimes with brochures, sometimes with cautionary language, and often with the same underlying thesis that debt-fueled expansion was the only credible paradigm. Dean would listen, ask 1 or 2 short questions about fixed obligations under weak-price scenarios, then return to whatever repair was in his hands. Ruth would note the date, offer coffee, and write down every quoted rate and term after Wade left. One September evening, she added a new page title, in notebook number 12, Offers Declined and Why. The first entry listed Wade's latest package at $194,300 with variable exposure after year 2. Her reason column held 4 words. Payment outruns uncertain weather. By first frost, their post-harvest closeout showed the hail damage clearly, yet the discipline held. Gross receipts came in below plan, repairs ran above baseline, and they still carried no operating debt past harvest. Year-end liquid position was not celebratory, but it was intact and honest. Dean closed the ledger, looked at Ruth, and said, "Same rule next year." She answered, "Same rule every year." Then she wrote the final line for 1979 in neat block letters. Control retained. The next morning, Ruth reopened notebook number 11, drew a double line under control retained, and began the first page of 1980 with 3 columns, cash in bank, obligations due, and weather-sensitive exposure. Dean carried coffee to the table, still in work clothes, and read down the page while she penciled in January fuel contracts and spring seed estimates. Their opening liquid position stood at $104,860, with no land mortgage and no equipment liens, but the new variable operating line sat at 16.2% and could move higher before harvest. Ruth wrote one sentence at the top margin. Protect optionality before protecting pride. Dean tapped the sentence once and went to the shop to pull the inspection plate off the 4020. By March 1980, the Holloways had already made 4 choices that looked small to anyone outside the ledger and decisive to anyone inside it. They cut projected fuel use by reorganizing tillage passes, reducing duplicate field travel by 11.8%. They bought 2 pallets of discounted filters and belts in preseason for $612 instead of paying about $948 in season. They signed a forward wheat contract on 35% of expected bushels at a price that covered fertilizer and seed before any prepay left their account. And they rejected a shiny planter trade that would have required $8,400 down plus $512 monthly for 60 months. Ruth entered the alternative in red. Total financed outflow $39,120 before repairs, compared with a $1,180 rebuild on their current unit. Their yearly progression began to look almost mechanical, though there was nothing easy about it. In 1980, gross farm receipts reached $186,740 across owned and rented ground. Total production costs came in at $146,980. Household draw stayed at $8,060, and taxes plus insurance consumed $9,960, leaving net retained cash of $21,740. Liquid reserves closed at $126,600. In 1981, rates climbed again, rainfall missed 2 key windows, and neighbors called it a year for survival only. The Holloways still finished with $18,930 added to reserves because they postponed non-essential steel purchases, used custom harvest help only on the heaviest week, and avoided carrying input notes into winter. Liquid closed at $100,000 to $45,530. If you want to track how discipline compounds in slow increments before it appears dramatic, stay with this sequence, because the arithmetic gets sharper as pressure rises. In 1982, they leased 80 distressed acres at $39 per acre, cash from an owner who needed certainty more than top rent, adding production without fixed debt service. The lease cost was $3,120. Additional fuel, seed, and fertilizer for that ground totaled $12,860. Revenue from those acres, even in a restrained yield year, reached $27,440. Net contribution after direct costs was $11,460 before overhead allocation. That same summer, Dean tore down the 4020 hydraulic system and engine top end with a parts bill of $1,460, plus 64 hours of his labor instead of replacing the tractor, at roughly $58,000 financed. At 12.4% over 7 years, that replacement path would have demanded about $1,030 monthly and about $86,520 total cash outflow. Their path demanded $1,460 in patience. 1982 closed with $37,410 added, and reserves at $182,940. Ruth's notebook for 1983 carried a new insert. A year-by-year ledger, she updated each quarter to test whether they were drifting from method into comfort. 1980, retain $21,740, reserve $126,600. 1981, retained $18,930, reserve $145,530. 1982, retained $37,410, reserve $182,940. 1983 projection in January had been $24,000 retained if rainfall normalized. Actual retention became $28,760 because they captured two discounted machinery lots from a retirement auction for $2,240 total and put them into service after $690 of repairs, avoiding roughly $14,000 in financed replacements. Reserve closed 1983 at $211,700. In 1984, with stress everywhere in Kansas lending offices, they retained $46,580 by prepaying fertilizer only against contracted grain and by negotiating one landlord rent adjustment tied to actual county yield bands. Reserve rose to $258,280. In 1985, they added $54,200, bringing liquid reserves to $312,480 with zero liens and full production records through 22 spirals. From the road, none of this looked like wealth accumulation. Dean still drove the same Chevrolet platform, now with primer patches over old rust and a seat seam repaired twice by hand. Ruth still wore a faded work jacket with one replaced zipper pull. Their farmhouse still took wind through the north windows in January. At Miller's coffee stop, men still read appearance first and balance sheet second. The social hierarchy in those rooms favored new paint, dealership hats, and confidence with payment talk. Wade Mercer remained fluent in that language. He was not a caricature. He understood equipment cycles, tax timing, and operator psychology. What he underestimated was the non-trivial downside when variable debt met volatile weather. The contrast sharpened because good people chose the conventional playbook and got caught by conditions they did not create. Tom Behrens, who farmed 640 acres his father had assembled over 3 decades, refinanced land and added machinery on a variable package, totaling $412,000 when rates looked manageable. At first, the structure looked workable. Projected annual debt service near $51,000 against expected operating margin near $78,000. Then rates reset higher, 2 yields came in below trend, and annual debt service moved toward $73,000 while margins compressed below $40,000. Tom sold cattle, then sold equipment, then sold time. None of it bridged the gap. His foreclosure auction drew friends who stood silent because there was nothing left to say. Lila and Ben Ortega faced a different but equally punishing equation. They installed irrigation and stacked machinery notes totaling $228,000 to stabilize output on an irrigated quarter and adjacent rented acres. The sales pitch had emphasized control over rainfall risk. The underlying trade-off was fixed payment risk. Their annual loan obligations reached about $34,200 before labor and fuel. In 2 difficult seasons, electric costs and repairs rose while commodity prices softened, and the pivot that was supposed to reduce uncertainty became one more payment with a due date that did not care about market timing. They did not fail from laziness or vanity. They failed from leverage meeting bad sequence. Carl Dwyer expanded hog capacity with a $149,000 note after several profitable years convinced many operators that scale would absorb volatility. His modeled feed cost per head assumed a band that held for a while and then broke upward. When feed surged and rates climbed, break-even moved above market price for multiple runs. Carl covered losses with short-term credit, hoping for one strong quarter to reset. It did not arrive in time. Liquidation followed, then years of contract hauling and seasonal work. Dean never used Carl's name as proof of anything. He called him a hard-working man who got cornered by numbers. By late summer 1983, foreclosure notices were posted so often that courthouse bulletin boards looked like sale catalogs. One Wednesday in Concordia listed 6 farm-related auctions inside 10 days. In Reno County, 2 local lenders tightened renewals and required additional collateral on notes that had been routine 3 seasons earlier. Variable rates brushed 21% in stress windows, and each increase translated directly into monthly cash burn for financed operators. A $300,000 variable balance at 11% carried about $33,000 annual interest. At 19%, it carried about $57,000. At 21%, about $63,000. That spread was not theoretical. It was payroll, seed, taxes, and sleep. The Holloways felt the same weather and sold into the same prices, but their structure converted shocks into discomfort instead of collapse. They had no term equipment payments. They had no land mortgage. They had one disciplined operating line cleared by harvest whenever possible. In weak years, reserves absorbed variance. In stronger years, reserves rebuilt. Ruth's stress pages modeled 3 bad outcomes at once: lower yield, lower price, and higher short-term rates. If the model showed forced sale risk, they reduced exposure before planning. Dean called it farming the downside first. During the dry stretch, they also leased additional distressed acres cautiously, never taking ground that required borrowed machinery to service. Cash rent at $39 per acre on selected parcels gave them productive scale without long-term debt traps. 3 days passed after one particularly tense bank meeting in 1984 before dispatch from their grain buyer confirmed contract slots for fall delivery. And that call mattered because Ruth had matched fertilizer prepay to those slots field by field. Without contracted coverage, no prepay left the account. With coverage, they prepaid only up to conservative yield estimates. This kept input exposure tied to saleable bushels and prevented the common spiral of financing one season's inputs with next season's hope. Dean executed the plan in the field with near-monastic consistency. Maintain old equipment, replace parts before failure, and run hours that matched their true labor capacity instead of imagined expansion capacity. Wade kept coming out in his pressed cap, sometimes to sell, sometimes to check, sometimes perhaps to understand what he was seeing. He walked around the machine shed one October and looked at the rehabilitated fleet lined in working order. "You are surviving on luck," he said, though the tone held less certainty than before. Dean set a wrench on the bench and answered without heat. "Luck does not reconcile receipts." Ruth later recorded the visit in notebook number 19 under market observations, then listed the latest dealer financing terms and her margin note. Fixed obligations still outrun conservative yield case. By the close of 1985, their position had become difficult to dismiss, even for critics who still disliked the style. Liquid reserves sat at $312,480. No equipment lands, no land mortgages. 22 spiral notebooks archived by year, each reconciled to bank statements, settlement slips, and tax filings. They had endured the same drought windows, the same rate spikes, and the same price pressure that broke better-dressed operations. The difference was not intelligence or virtue. The difference was structural. Low fixed commitments, high record fidelity, disciplined timing, and no willingness to rent the future for present approval. On the first Monday of January 1986, Ruth placed notebook number 23 beside a coffee mug and wrote the year on the front in black marker. Dean came in carrying the mail and set one envelope on the table without opening it. Cloud County Estate Auction Notice, 480 contiguous acres. Sale in March. He looked at Ruth, then at the notebook, and said, We should run the numbers before sunup tomorrow. She nodded once, turned to a clean page, and wrote the opening line for a new calculation. Acquisition only if productive value exceeds purchase price under conservative yield. Paid in cash. Ruth left the notebook open to that line, then pulled the legal pad closer and built the purchase ceiling from the ground up, while Dean sorted the mail into 3 stacks. Tax forms, seed circulars, and sale notices. She did not begin with bid strategy. She began with yield bands. On the 480-acre tract, she penciled conservative wheat at 31 bushels per acre, sorghum at 63, and a blended gross revenue case that assumed weaker pricing than the previous 3-year average. Then she subtracted cash rent equivalents, fuel, repairs, insurance, and a contingency line set at 12%. The productive value came in between $452 and $489 per acre, depending on moisture. She drew a box around one number, maximum cash bid, $205,000, no exceptions. Dean read the number twice. If it goes above, we let it go. By the 3rd week of March, 1986, they were standing on frozen gravel at the Cloud County Estate auction, while men in cleaner coats estimated which lender-backed group would take the tract. Dean looked like he had come to watch. The C-20 had fresh primer over old rust, one taillight lens taped at the corner, and the odometer now read 301,400 42 miles. Ruth carried 2 spirals and the same calculator from 1978. Bidding opened fast, then thinned as credit committees reached their limits. Dean entered at $380 per acre, paused, then stayed steady in $10 steps. At $410 per acre, the ringman called for more and got silence. Total, $196,800. Cash? Ruth wrote the final figure before the echo faded, then turned to a second page titled Deployment. Half the tract, 240 acres, would be leased to a displaced young couple at cost-based terms, so the land would produce and a family could restart without suffocating payments. She penciled their names after Dean introduced them near the gate. Eli and Mara Kessler, both exhausted, both still willing to work. Lease rate, $52 per acre, when nearby offers were pushing $68 to $74. Annual lease total, $12,480. Included in the contract, drafted in plain language and signed at the Holloway table 2 weeks later, was one clause Ruth insisted on. If the Kesslers saved a 20% down payment and maintained 3 clean years of field records, they would have first option to buy 80 acres at appraised value less 10%. That was the first time the notebook became a bridge for someone else, not just a barrier against risk. From 1987 through 1993, the Holloways expanded only when numbers stayed submissive to weather reality. Ruth tracked acquisitions, leases, and retained earnings in parallel columns to make sure land growth never outran liquidity. Dean kept the same machinery discipline: fix, maintain, defer vanity. Their reserve account crossed $1 million in 1990, then $2 million in 1992, even after tax payments and periodic tile work. Wade kept dropping by with proposals, though the tone shifted from instruction to negotiation. He brought used inventory sheets now, not only new gloss brochures, and asked whether Dean wanted to put some leverage to work while rates were friendlier. Dean would ask one question every time: what happens in 2 bad years? Wade seldom answered directly. In those years, the argument in the county never really changed. It only got quieter. Some operators optimized for appearance: new paint, larger notes, faster expansion, while others optimized for staying power when weather and rates turned together. The Holloways kept choosing staying power, one season at a time, and by then even their critics could see where that path was leading. The reveal arrived in March 1994 at a Reno County liquidation that pulled bankers, brokers, landlords, and every farmer within an hour's drive. The headline lot was 1,920 acres with grain storage and handling capacity that most people assumed would go to an institutional buyer. Wade stood near the registration table in a pressed blue shirt, speaking with two lenders about serious bidders only. When Dean and Ruth walked in, conversation dipped, then resumed with the same old assumption attached. Patched sleeves, old truck keys, observers, not actors. Wade saw Dean's bidder card and said, loud enough to travel, "You still proving points, Dean? Or are you finally ready to finance like the rest of the grown operations?" A few people laughed with that familiar social ease. Dean did not return the line. Ruth opened notebook number 31 to a page already labeled Liquidation Parameters and slid it to him. Maximum bid sat in thick pencil, $1,170,000 cash, preserving post-purchase liquidity floor of $2,500,000. Bidding began at $900,000 and moved in hard jumps. Two out-of-county groups drove it past $1 million to $50,000. Dean entered once at $1,080,000. Then again at $1,102,000, then stayed in measured increments as one group dropped and the second hesitated. At $1,126,000, the ringman looked left, right, then called sold. Dean signed the purchase sheet. Ruth requested wiring instructions, then handed over a certified check already prepared through their bank relationship for immediate settlement. Wade stared at the check, then at Dean, then asked the clerk if he could verify funds. The clerk, visibly irritated, passed him the speakerphone. Wade called the issuing bank, identified the instrument number, and asked whether the account would clear. The bank officer answered without drama. "Certified instrument, valid. Related accounts hold $3,840,000 liquid as of this morning. No equipment lines, no land mortgages on file." The crowd did not clap. It went quiet in that particular way, only arithmetic can command. Wade removed his cap and held it at his side. "I spent 15 years selling urgency," he said, voice lower now. "And you spent 15 years buying time." Dean looked at him and answered in 9 words. "Debt rents your future before weather ever does." By harvest 1994, the Holloways were integrating the newly purchased acres, not celebrating them. Ruth adjusted labor schedules, storage flow, and field rotation plans line by line. She also opened a new section in notebook number 32 titled Outward Commitments. The first entries were modest and direct. A zero-interest note of $68,000 to Carl Dwyer for a grain truck and shop tooling so he could build stable off-farm income while continuing seasonal fieldwork. A $42,000 equipment bridge for Tom Behrens to launch a machine and welding shop without bank debt. And a standing offer to the Kesslers for discounted transfer terms if they met their savings and records clause. 3 seasons later, by August 1997, those entries had multiplied into a formal but simple system. The Holloways issued 5-year, zero-interest equipment notes to qualified young operators who presented complete enterprise budgets and agreed to send Ruth quarterly ledger pages. No collateral games, no punitive terms. If a drought year hit, payment could be deferred 1 cycle with written documentation. Between 1997 and 2008, 4 operators received notes totaling $640,000. Eli and Mara Kessler, $180,000 for a used combine, and headers. Elena Ortega and her husband, Lucas Ray, $160,000 for planter, drill, and grain carts. Noah Pritchard, $140,000 for irrigation, rehabilitation, and a modest tractor package bought used. And Hannah Vale, $100,000 to $60,000 for pasture fencing, hay equipment, and a small cattle handling system. Every note was tied to accounting literacy, not charisma. Ruth required monthly cost tracking by enterprise, a debt-to-revenue cap, and a post-harvest reconciliation meeting at her kitchen table. She did not lecture. She asked questions. Where did this variance come from? Why did repairs spike in June? Which expenses are recurring and which are one-time? The recipients learned quickly that the money was generous and the standards were strict. Word of that method traveled without advertising because the results were visible in repaired shops, renewed leases, and operators who could explain every line of their costs. Around kitchen tables and parts counters, people started to separate bigger payments from bigger progress. The outcomes were measurable, and Ruth measured them relentlessly. The Kesslers completed their note in 58 months, never missed a quarter report, and exercised the 80-acre purchase option in 2003 at a 10% discount to appraised value. Appraised price was $1,950 per acre. Contract price after discount $1,755. Total $140,400. They paid $28,080 down from savings and financed the remaining $112,320 through a local bank at manageable terms because their records were impeccable. By 2024, they operated 520 acres, carried low debt, and had not missed a payment cycle in 15 years. Elena Ortega and Lucas Ray used their $160,000 note to lease back 160 family acres tied to the Ortega line that had been lost in the crisis years. Their first 2 seasons were thin but stable because equipment costs were fixed at 0 interest and because they pre-committed input spending to contracted bushels, exactly as Ruth taught. By year 5, they had rebuilt working capital to $186,000 and later purchased an adjacent 40-acre parcel with 35% down. Lila and Ben, now older and out of full-time production, watched their daughter and son-in-law farm that ground profitably without the payment stack that had broken their own operation. The emotional repair mattered as much as the financial one. Tom Behrens never returned to large-acre row crop farming, and nobody pushed him to. With the $42,000 bridge and his own discipline, he built Behrens' machine and field repair on rented shop space, then bought the building in 2006. By 2024, he employed 3 technicians, rented 40 acres for hay, and operated debt-free. He called Dean once each spring for planting season service work, and sent Ruth a handwritten thank you every December with his year-end figures folded inside. Carl Dwyer used the $68,000 note to stabilize his truck and fabrication work, then became an informal advisor to beginners on feed risk, note structure, and cash flow timing. He told young producers the truth without theatrics. I did not lose the hogs in one day. I lost margin 1 payment at a time. By 2024, he still drove grain during harvest, still paid cash for repairs, and still kept a notebook in his glove box. In 2012, after 3 dry summers in 5 years, the Holloways formalized a $300,000 county emergency grain fund managed through clear triggers. Yield losses above 25%, plus documented inability to secure affordable short-term feed or seed. Assistance could be structured as grants up to $15,000 or zero interest, seasonal loans up to $40,000. Between 2012 and 2023, the fund assisted 19 operations, disbursed $284,000, and recovered $171,000 in revolving repayments, allowing repeated support without permanent depletion. Then, in 2016, Ruth funded a $1,200,000 scholarship endowment focused on farm accounting literacy at the county level. Annual payout target was 4.5%, generating roughly $54,000 per year in scholarships and training grants. Recipients had to submit complete enterprise budgets and pass a practical, record-keeping module built around real invoices, lease terms, and yield histories. By spring 2024, 73 students and beginning operators had completed the program. Among participants who entered production, default rates over 5 years were 2.1% compared with a regional benchmark above 11% for similar early-stage operations. The deeper examination sat in 3 pages Ruth kept clipped inside notebook number 39, and those pages explained the whole philosophy more clearly than any speech. Page 1 tracked avoided fixed obligations from 1979 through 1994. Financed package declined in 1979. Avoided payment stream $32,880 annually. Major equipment replacements deferred or rebuilt. Cumulative avoided financed outflow $1,486,000. Interest expense avoided under variable stress scenarios estimated $612,000. Page 2 tracked retained reserves and deployment. Liquid reserve $104,860 in 1980, $312,480 in 1985, $1,040,000 in 1990, $3,840,000 by March 1994, before the 1,920-acre purchase, then rebuilt through operating surpluses and disciplined capital timing. Page 3 tracked multiplier impact from generosity. $640,000 in zero-interest notes, $300,000 emergency fund, $1,200,000 scholarship endowment. Total directed commitments, $2,140,000. Farms or businesses stabilized directly, at least 9. Acres retained or reclaimed by recipients and their families, 3,400. Estimated land value tied to those retained acres in 2024 pricing, about $16,100,000. That was the arithmetic hidden behind faded denim and an old truck. Not luck, not image, sequence, restraint, and exact records. By the first week of October 2024, Ruth was at the same kitchen table with a new spiral, a coffee mug, and a seed catalog, entering fuel pre-buys and scholarship payout projections on the same page because she believed household prudence, farm solvency, and community durability belonged in one ledger. Dean came in from a local run in the repaired Chevrolet platform, set down the mail, and asked whether the Ortega Ray acreage report had arrived. She nodded and tapped the envelope. Ruth drew a neat line under the day's entries, capped her pen, and slid the Ortega Ray report beside the seed catalog for morning review. Dean pulled out a chair, and the two of them went through the mail the way they always had, quietly, line by line, treating the next decision with the same discipline that had carried them this far. Ruth opened the Ortega Ray report first, flattened the stapled pages with her palm, and read the top line out loud while Dean sorted the rest of the envelopes by date. Elena and Lucas had finished the third quarter close with gross receipts of $412,600, total operating costs of $308,440, and a retained margin of $104,160 before taxes, with no delinquent obligations and $226,300 in working capital after setting aside next season's input reserve. Ruth circled one ratio in blue pencil, debt service at 8.4% of gross revenue, then drew a check mark beside the line that mattered most to her. Full records submitted, every variance explained. Dean leaned over, read the page twice, and nodded. "They are running it right." Ruth slid the report beside the seed catalog and wrote one entry in notebook number 40. Ortega Ray controls steady, risk band acceptable, mentorship hour approved. By the end of October, the Holloway table had hosted all 4 zero-interest note families for quarterly reviews, and each meeting showed what disciplined generosity looked like after the first grateful season faded and ordinary pressure returned. Eli and Mara Kessler arrived with binders organized by field, machine hours, and cost per bushel. Their 520-acre operation closed the year at $598,200 gross, $451,760 total cost, and $146,440 retained before taxes, with $310,000 in cash reserves and only one term note remaining on storage improvements. They had met every obligation, bought no status equipment, and added 24 acres from a retiring neighbor with 35% down in cash. Ruth did not praise them with big language. She asked one question. "What breaks this model?" Mara answered first. "Taking on payments because somebody says we look behind." Ruth smiled once and wrote response a line. Elena Ortega and Lucas Ray came 2 nights later with their own ledgers, and Lila's old recipe tin repurposed for receipts. Their reclaimed 160 acres, plus leased ground, produced lower yield in one dry block, but crop insurance, conservative prepay, and strict maintenance timing kept net positive. They had paid down their bank balance faster than scheduled, from $112,320 to $71,900, and they had not used revolving credit for operating expense once in 5 years. Ben Ortega, slower on his feet now, waited in the truck and listened when Lucas came back out to explain the numbers. He cried quietly, not from sentimentality, but from relief that the acreage tied to his family name no longer sat under a payment stack built to break at the first bad sequence. Noah Pritchard's trajectory was rougher, then steadier. The irrigation rehabilitation, funded by his $140,000 note, required $22,600 more in unexpected well and line repair in year 2, and for 1 quarter he drifted above Ruth's target debt-to-revenue band. He did the one thing she required when people slipped. He reported it early. They reworked timing, paused non-essential purchases, and redirected custom work income straight to principal. By 2024, his balance was cleared, his machinery line was paid, and his annual gross reached $486,900 with a retained margin near $96,000. He still drove a truck older than Dean's second backup, still kept a paper ledger in the glove box, and still sent Ruth his monthly numbers on the first Monday. Hannah Vale, youngest of the 4, turned the cattle and hay package into the most stable cash flow of the group. Her fencing and handling system cut labor hours and shrink. Her hay equipment paid for itself in 3 seasons, and she used the saved cash to buy 28 acres adjoining her pasture with 40% down. Her 2024 statements showed $352,400 gross, $241,100 total costs, and $111,300 retained before taxes, with a reserve account at $188,000 and no overdue bills. She had started mentoring two beginning operators through the scholarship program because Ruth's funding terms required one thing beyond repayment: pass the method forward. If you are learning something from this, pass it along to one operator who thinks scale alone creates safety. By mid-November, Ruth aggregated the outcomes the way she always did, not as celebration, as verification. Zero interest notes issued, $640,000. Fully repaid principal, $640,000. Emergency grain fund dispersed since launch, $284,000. Repaid to revolve, $171,000. Scholarship endowment principal, $1,200,000. Program completers entering production, 51. 5-year default rate among those entrants, 2.1%. Acres directly stabilized or reclaimed across recipients and their households, 3,400. At an average 2024 land value, near $4,735 per acre across mixed quality tracts, that represented about $16,099,000 in controlled, productive ground held by families who had nearly been priced out of continuity. Ruth wrote the total in black ink, then underlined the phrase she cared about more than the number: control retained locally. Wade Mercer's resolution came without spectacle. The same way his certainty had first arrived decades earlier, through a conversation at a county table. He had retired from dealership sales in 2008 after commissions made him comfortable, then spent his final working years doing cash-only used equipment consulting for younger operators who wanted durability over shine. At first, people assumed it was rebranding. Then they noticed he had changed the questions he asked. He no longer opened with horsepower or promotional rates. He opened with annual fixed obligations under weak price scenarios, parts availability, and what happened if rain missed 2 windows in a row. In 2015, at a winter producer panel in Hutchinson, he said into a microphone in front of about 180 people, "I sold urgency for too long. The Holloways sold me on arithmetic." By the first week of December 2024, Wade was 74, mostly retired for real, and living with his wife in a modest house outside town. He called Dean once that week to ask whether a young tenant should buy a late-model combine with financing or keep rebuilding a paid-for unit. Dean answered in 11 words, "Run 5 bad-year cases, and they keep the one that survives." Wade laughed, thanked him, and later repeated that line to 3 clients. He was not ruined, not disgraced, not mocked. He adjusted, admitted the misread, and spent his final professional chapter helping people avoid the trap he had once marketed as progress. 3 days before Christmas, the scholarship board met in a room above the old feed store, and Ruth read names while Dean checked figures beside her. 73 awards had been issued since inception, with annual payouts still near the target band and principal preserved. Tom Behrens chaired the equipment literacy module now, demonstrating repair economics with invoices from his own shop. He still rented 40 acres for hay, still ran Behrens' machine and field repair debt-free, and still mailed Ruth his year-end note in December. Lila Ortega was 76 and living in Concordia, keeping a garden and helping Elena with record filing during tax season. Ben Ortega was 78, no longer farming full-time, but he still rode out to check stands twice a month and still called Lucas every Sunday evening to discuss moisture and diesel use. Carl Dwyer remained the harvest driver everyone trusted in tight windows, and he had become the county's blunt, kind voice on note structure, often ending talks with the sentence that had cost him years to earn: "Payment dates do not care about your hope." Eli and Mara Kessler now employed one full-time hand and one seasonal college student from the scholarship pool. Elena and Lucas Ray had expanded storage and reduced basis risk by timing sales, with their oldest daughter already learning bookkeeping from Lila at the same table where receipts once piled in panic. Noah Pritchard had paid cash for his last major pump replacement and had started a winter workshop on irrigation maintenance economics. Hannah Vale had grown her herd without borrowing for vanity editions and had put two mentees through their first full-year enterprise budgets with no missing categories. Every one of them could explain cost per acre, break-even price, and liquidity buffer without guessing. That was Ruth's actual curriculum. Dean and Ruth remained in the drafty farmhouse by choice, not necessity. The household budget had changed with inflation, but not philosophy. Still modest relative to income, still tracked category by category. Their core acreage remained under direct control at $3,740, with treasuries near $2,700,000 and no debt on land or equipment. The old Chevrolet platform had long retired from major hauling and now handled local runs to feed church and town meetings. The 1969 4020 still worked, slower than modern units, but dependable, because Dean serviced it by hours and never skipped the off-season teardown list. In Ruth's archive room, 40 spiral notebooks sat boxed by year, each cross-referenced to bank statements, settlement sheets, and tax files, and notebook number 40 was filling at the same measured pace. By the second week of January 2025, snow had sealed the lane edges, and the table held seed trials, scholarship renewals, and one envelope from a beginning farmer asking for help interpreting a lender package. Dean read the letter, slid it to Ruth, and put water on for coffee. She opened to a clean page, wrote the date, and started the same way she had started for decades. Cash in bank, obligations due, weather-sensitive exposure. Wealth looked ordinary on that table because it had always been built in ordinary lines. Subscribe if you want more stories where arithmetic beats appearance over the long run. Then leave a comment with one number you track in your own operation that keeps you honest when pressure rises. Share this with one person who confuses bigger payments with bigger progress. Because that misunderstanding still costs good families land they should have kept. Ruth capped her pen, set it beside the mug, and turned the seed catalog 1/4 turn toward Dean so he could see the hybrids she had marked. The newest spiral notebook rested between them, plain as school paper, exact as a bank audit, and powerful enough to keep a future from being rented away. The next morning, before first light reached the machine shed, Ruth slid the Ortega Ray report into a manila folder labeled Recipient Reviews 2024, hole-punched a copy for the Scholarship Board records, and filed the original in Archive Box 40 between the Kessler packet and the Vale packet. Then she opened the envelope from the beginning farmer, read it again, and handed it to Dean with the lender terms circled in pencil. Variable line at 12.8% for year 1, floating after that. Equipment bundle tied to approval. Balloon in year 5. Dean read the page, breathed out, and said, "Call him in for Thursday." On Thursday afternoon, Caleb Morrow parked a faded sedan beside the retired Chevrolet platform and came in carrying a legal pad already filled with numbers. He was 23, leasing his first 120 acres, and looked the way every beginner looked when a payment sheet had been sold as destiny. Ruth set coffee down, turned notebook number 40 toward him, and asked him to read his own plan out loud. He stumbled twice at the debt service total, corrected himself, and looked at Dean like he expected a lecture. Dean did not give one. He pointed to the interest reset clause and asked, What happens if you miss rain and corn drops 60 cents? Caleb answered honestly. I do not make the October payment. Ruth nodded once, wrote 3 alternatives on a clean page, and worked through them line by line. Used planter cash purchase at $18,400 instead of financed package share, custom harvest for year 1, and a zero-interest bridge note from the Holloway's program capped at $42,000 with monthly ledger submission. Payment under the bank package would have run him about $3,180 per month before fuel and labor in peak season. Under the revised structure, his fixed monthly obligation fell below $980, with a required liquidity reserve target of $24,000 before any expansion. Caleb stayed at the table until dark, recalculated every category, and signed the simpler plan with hands that shook less by the last page. The envelope that had arrived as a warning left as a contract with terms he could survive. By late February, the scholarship board met again above the old feed store, and this time Ruth brought one more folder than usual. Caleb's first-month ledger went around the table beside his cash flow projection and risk notes, and Tom Behrens, now chairman of the Equipment Literacy Module, tapped the page where Caleb had priced repairs against financed replacement. He learned the right lesson early, Tom said. Carl Dwyer, still blunt and kind, added, he learned it before a bank taught it the hard way. The board voted to approve him for training support, and his case became the 74th funded track under the endowment. 3 weeks later, on a windy Saturday in March, the Holloways hosted all 4 original zero-interest note families and the newer scholarship operators in the machine shed for the annual ledger workshop. Eli Kessler arrived first with Mara and their 2 hired hands, then Elena and Lucas Ray with Lila's recipe tin of receipts, then Noah Pritchard in his old pickup, then Hannah Vale with 2 mentees carrying binders bigger than they were. Ruth stood at the folding table with a stack of blank spirals and a printed sheet titled 5-Year Survival Test. She taught the same way she always had, with no speeches and no performance. Show me gross. Now show me fixed obligations. Now show me bad year yield. Each operator had to run 3 stress cases out loud while the group checked the math. Noah's irrigation line replacement penciled at $14,200 held up under 2 dry years because he had prepaid half in cash. Hannah's herd expansion plan failed the first pass because feed assumptions were too optimistic. She revised it on the spot and cut projected headcount by 12. Elena and Lucas presented storage timing numbers that lifted realized price by 32 cents per bushel across 1 block, and Ruth made them explain exactly how they protected basis risk without borrowing short. By the time coffee ran out, every sheet had corrections, initials, and a filing destination. Nothing stayed loose. In April, Ruth completed the annual multiplier page and read it to Dean at the kitchen table while rain tapped the north windows. Direct zero-interest notes repaid in full, $640,000. Emergency grain fund active balance after revolving repayments, $187,000. Scholarship endowment principal preserved at $1,200,000 with annual payout on target. Document farms and related rural businesses stabilized through direct and second-order support, 12. Total acres under control by those households, 3,740 from Holloway ground and 3,612 across recipient networks. Combined acreage, 7,352. At Spring County averages, that represented productive land value above $33 million, controlled by operators trained to read risk before signing it. Dean listened, took off his glasses, and said the same thing he had said for decades when numbers were strong. File it where it can be checked. Ruth filed it in Archive Box 40 under Community Impact, cross-referenced to bank statements, board minutes, and signed note closures. Wade Mercer's final chapter closed in person, not by rumor. In June 2025, at a county fair finance panel set under a white tent, Wade stood beside Dean in front of about 200 folding chairs and held up an old dealership brochure from 1979. The paper had yellowed at the edges, and Wade's voice carried a little less force than it once had, but it did not waver. "I used to lead with monthly payment and horsepower," he said. "Now I lead with downside and liquidity. I learned that from these two." He turned to Dean and Ruth, paused, and added, "The look I gave him back then at the coffee stop, I never had the courage to explain it. It was not confidence. It was fear that my own business model needed people to borrow." Then he folded the brochure in half and set it on the table. Done with it? After the panel, Wade walked to the Chevrolet platform parked by the fence, touched the repaired mirror still braced by twine, and laughed softly. "Still here?" Dean nodded. "Still useful." Wade retired fully that fall, transferred his client list to a younger consultant who agreed to cash flow first advisement, and moved with his wife into a smaller house near their daughter. He was not cast out, and he was not celebrated as a hero. He changed, stated why, and spent his last working years reducing harm. In December 2025, he sent Ruth a typed note with one line underlined, "Sold urgency. Bought humility late. Better late than never." By the second week of October 2026, the roll call sat complete on Ruth's table, each name checked against the current report. Dean Holloway, 79, still drove local runs, still serviced the 4020 by hours, still refused new paint unless rust demanded primer. Ruth Holloway, 78, still balanced to the penny, still taught the literacy module twice each winter, still archived each spiral with source documents attached. Tom Behrens operated his machine shop with 4 employees now, rented the same 40 hay acres, and remained debt-free. Lila Ortega, 78, lived in Concordia, healthy enough to attend spring planting lunches and strict enough to catch missing receipt dates in Elena's files. Ben Ortega, 80, used a cane and watched fields from the pickup, but still reviewed fuel logs every Sunday. Elena and Lucas Ray reduced their remaining land note below $40,000 and added conservation strips without subsidy debt. Eli and Mara Kessler expanded to 560 acres, kept debt service below 10% of gross, and funded 1 scholarship each year in Lila's name. Noah Pritchard taught winter irrigation economics at the co-op classroom. Hannah Vale chaired the Mentorship Requirement Committee and required every new applicant to submit handwritten monthly ledgers before digital copies. Carl Dwyer kept driving grain in harvest windows and speaking at beginner nights. In November 2026, he stood in front of 19 new operators and held up his glove-box notebook, worn at the spine. "This little book saved me the second time," he said. "First time, I had numbers in my head. Head numbers lie when you are tired." Caleb Morrow, the young man from the envelope, closed his first full year with positive retained earnings, reserve above target, and no delinquent bills. He sent Ruth his ledger in person and asked if he could mentor next year's first applicant. She handed him a blank spiral and said, "Start by checking your own line items twice." Every physical thread that had carried the Holloway's story was accounted for. The old brochures Wade had used to sell financed urgency were boxed and donated to the County Agricultural History Room as teaching material for rate risk classes. The speakerphone verification transcript from the 1994 sale had been copied into board archives and cited in literacy sessions as a case study in liquidity discipline. The Ortega-Ray reports, Kessler binders, Vail training sheets, Pritchard irrigation logs, and Barron's shop statements were all filed in indexed order in the archive room with duplicate copies at the scholarship office. The letters and calls that had asked for help received written outcomes, either a funded path with terms or a document decline with the reasons. Nothing lingered unresolved in a drawer. On a cold January evening in 2027, after chores and after supper dishes were dried, Dean set 2 mugs on the table and turned the seed catalog toward Ruth. She opened a new spiral notebook, wrote the date in the block numbers, and made the first 3 lines exactly as she always had. Cash in bank, obligations due, weather-sensitive exposure. Then she added 1 more line, new only in wording, old in meaning. Generosity deployed must remain auditable. Dean read it, smiled without showing teeth, and reached for his pencil. Outside, wind moved through the shelter belt and rattled the machine shed doors. Inside, the notebook lay plain beside coffee and paper seed plots, ordinary to any passing eye. Yet that simple spiral had outlasted rate shocks, hail, drought, fashion, ego, and fear. It had kept land in families, rebuilt work for people who had been cornered, and taught a county that wealth could wear patched denim and still write certified checks. The final arithmetic never changed. Appearance talked, payments bragged, records decided.